Picture this. It's 1997. A tiny chip company in Silicon Valley can't make payroll. The lights in the office are literally dimmed to save on electricity. The CEO has just fired 70% of his staff. A video game company, Sega, is the only reason this company is still breathing, handing them $5 million out of pure goodwill. Nobody in the world thought this company would survive. Fast forward to October 2025. That same company, the one that couldn't pay its employees, just became the first company in the entire history of capitalism to cross a $5 trillion valuation. Bigger than Apple, bigger than Microsoft, bigger than Amazon, the most valuable company on Earth, and the foundation on which ChatGPT, Tesla, Google, Meta, and almost every AI system you've ever used was built. So how does a company go from almost dead to literally running the world? That's exactly what we're about to find out. Welcome back. If that intro just made your jaw drop a little, good, because the full story is 10 times more insane than that. This is the complete rise of Nvidia. The near deaths, the billion-dollar bets, the one quiet decision in 2006 that nobody noticed, and that ended up being worth trillions. And the man at the center of all of it, who started with literally nothing. I promise you, by the end of this video, the way you see artificial intelligence, money, and power will never be the same. Let's get into it. In October 2025, something happened that had never happened before in the history of capitalism. A single company, a chip maker from Santa Clara, California, became the first public company on Earth to cross a $5 trillion valuation. Not Apple, not Microsoft, not Amazon. Nvidia, a company that 30 years earlier was 1 month away from running out of money to pay its own employees. Think about that for a second. The lights were literally being dimmed in their offices to save on electricity bills. Engineers were being laid off. Silicon Valley was laughing at them. And Sega, a video game company, handed them $5 million just to keep them breathing. That's where this story begins. Not in a gleaming corporate campus, not at a billion-dollar funding round, but in a Denny's diner in San Jose at a corner booth over cheap coffee, where 3 engineers quietly decided to build something the world had never seen. Jensen Huang was 9 years old when his parents sent him from Taiwan to America, a country he had never lived in, speaking a language he barely knew. He didn't land in a warm family home. He ended up at a reform school in rural Kentucky called Oneida Baptist Institute, a place meant for troubled youth. His uncle had enrolled him there by mistake, genuinely believing it was a prestigious boarding school. Jensen didn't speak English fluently. He was relentlessly bullied. His daily chore as a 10-year-old was cleaning the dormitory toilets. Most kids would have broken. Jensen Huang sharpened. By 15, he had a national ranking in competitive table tennis. By the time his family finally reunited in Oregon, he was graduating high school early and heading toward engineering. He earned his bachelor's degree from Oregon State, then worked nights and weekends while holding a full-time job at a chip company to earn his master's from Stanford. He wasn't born rich. He wasn't born connected. He was the kind of person who worked the graveyard shift at Denny's to pay his bills, which makes it either deeply poetic or darkly funny that in 1993, he walked into a Denny's in San Jose and founded a company worth more than the GDP of most nations. With him were 2 engineers, Chris Malachowski from Sun Microsystems and Curtis Priam from IBM. Their combined starting capital was $40,000. They had no product, no customers, no factory. They had a bet. The bet was this: video games were about to change everything, and no computer chip in existence was powerful enough to keep up. In 1993, gaming was still a punchline. Doom had just launched. Computers were beige boxes that struggled to display color photographs. The idea that games would ever look realistic, that you'd feel like you were inside another world, seemed ridiculous to most of the industry. Jensen didn't think it was ridiculous. He thought it was inevitable. He also believed something more important, something that his competitors wouldn't fully grasp for another 2 decades. Graphics required a fundamentally different kind of computing. Not one brilliant processor handling instructions one at a time, but thousands of smaller processors working in absolute parallel, handling millions of tiny calculations all at once. Here's the clearest way to think about it. Imagine a CPU, a traditional computer chip, as one master chef in a kitchen. Incredibly skilled, capable of handling any recipe, any complexity, any request, but it cooks one thing at a time. Now imagine a GPU as 10,000 cooks, each handling one small slice of the same meal simultaneously. No single cook is brilliant, but together they can feed an entire stadium before that one master chef finishes plating his first dish. That difference, that architectural philosophy, is why Nvidia eventually conquered the world. But first, it nearly died. Nvidia's earliest years were a slow-motion disaster. Their first chip, the NV1, launched in 1995. It was technically bold and commercially irrelevant. Then Microsoft changed the rules. They introduced DirectX, a software standard that required all graphics chips to render using triangle-based graphics. Nvidia had built their chip around a completely different approach. Overnight, everything they'd built was wrong. Sega, who had contracted Nvidia to build chips for their gaming console, walked away. The contract that had been funding the company was gone. By 1996, Nvidia was down to 9 months of runway, and Jensen Huang was making brutal decisions. He cut 70% of his staff. He shut off non-essential lights to save money. And then he made a call that required extraordinary humility for a CEO. He went back to Sega, admitted the mistake, and asked to be let out of the contract, but still paid in full. Somehow, Sega agreed. They had nothing to gain, but their CEO said yes anyway. That $5 million became the oxygen that kept Nvidia alive long enough to build the chip that saved them. The Riva 128. The team designed it in 9 months, a timeline that should have been impossible. They used emulation software running at 1 frame every 30 seconds just to simulate the chip before it was built. When the chip came back from manufacturing and they powered it on for the first time, it worked perfectly. No crashes, no bugs. In its first 4 months, the Riva 128 sold 1 million units. Jensen Huang later called it the biggest comeback in Silicon Valley. He wasn't wrong, but the real comeback hadn't even started yet. In 1999, Nvidia launched the GeForce 256 and gave a new name to what they were building, the GPU, the graphics processing unit. That same year, they went public at a $600 million market cap. They were dominant in gaming. They were profitable. They had beaten every competitor in the graphics card race. Most CEOs would have declared victory and held the course. Jensen Huang became obsessed with a question almost nobody else was asking. What else can a GPU do? The answer began forming in university research labs, far away from Wall Street and far away from Silicon Valley's spotlight. In 2006, Nvidia quietly released a software platform called CUDA, Compute Unified Device Architecture. It was a programming toolkit that let developers use Nvidia GPUs for general-purpose computation, not just graphics. The reaction was almost completely silent. Gamers didn't care. Wall Street barely noticed. Financial analysts mentioned it in footnotes. CUDA cost an enormous amount to develop and had no obvious short-term payoff. Some inside Nvidia doubted whether it was worth the investment. But in university physics departments, in computational biology labs, in aerospace simulations, and in the early artificial intelligence research groups that were quietly working on neural networks, something else was happening. Scientists discovered that CUDA let them use Nvidia GPUs to run calculations that had previously taken days in just hours. The parallel architecture that made gaming look beautiful turned out to be perfectly suited for scientific computation at massive scale. And then came 2012, the year that changed everything. A graduate student in Toronto named Alex Krzyzewski was working under the legendary AI researcher Jeffrey Hinton. He was trying to build a neural network that could look in a photograph and accurately identify what was in it, a task that computers had been failing at, embarrassingly, for decades. Most of the field had given up on deep learning. Neural networks were considered a dead end, computationally too expensive, theoretically too limited. Krzyzewski and his colleague Ilya Sutskever, you'll hear that name again later, had a different idea. What if they trained the neural network on a GPU instead of a CPU? In a bedroom, on two Nvidia GTX 580 gaming graphics cards purchased off the shelf, they trained a neural network they called AlexNet. It won the ImageNet competition that year with an error rate of 15.3%, nearly 11 percentage points better than every human-designed algorithm that had been refined over decades. The second-place entry, built the traditional way, had an error rate of 26%. The world of artificial intelligence went silent for a moment, then erupted. Three things had converged for the first time in history: deep neural networks, massive datasets, and Nvidia GPU computing. Every serious AI researcher on Earth suddenly needed one thing above all others: Nvidia GPUs. And to use them efficiently, they needed CUDA. The moat that Nvidia had been quietly digging since 2006 was suddenly a canyon. Here's what made CUDA so strategically devastating. It wasn't just hardware, it was an ecosystem. By 2012, thousands of researchers had spent years learning CUDA, building libraries on top of it, writing tools for it, training students on it. All of that accumulated knowledge ran on Nvidia hardware, and only Nvidia hardware. Switching to a competitor's chip didn't just mean buying new hardware. It meant throwing away years of code, retraining entire teams, abandoning a software ecosystem that the entire field had built together. Jensen Huang had accidentally, or brilliantly, baked a lock-in that no competitor could easily undo. The years between 2012 and 2022 saw the field of AI transform beyond recognition. Convolutional networks, recurrent networks, GANs, reinforcement learning. And then, in 2017, a paper from Google researchers introduced the transformer architecture, the mathematical foundation that would eventually power ChatGPT, Gemini, Claude, and every other large language model you've ever heard of. Every one of these breakthroughs ran on Nvidia GPUs. Every researcher who made them used CUDA. The company's data center business, once trivial compared to gaming, was doubling, then tripling, then growing so fast the charts looked like they'd been drawn incorrectly. But the world still hadn't fully understood what was coming. November 30th, 2022. OpenAI released ChatGPT, 100 million users in 60 days, the fastest product adoption in human history. Suddenly, artificial intelligence was no longer a research topic. It was a product that anyone could use on their phone, in their browser, right now. And every single conversation, every single question, every single response required an enormous amount of computation running on Nvidia hardware. The race didn't begin at that moment, but the rest of the world finally understood that a race was happening. Microsoft immediately announced a $10 billion investment in OpenAI and began integrating AI into every product it owned. Google declared an internal code red and scrambled to accelerate its own AI development. Meta began pouring billions into building open-source AI models. Amazon committed to massive AI infrastructure investment through AWS. Every single one of them had the same problem. They needed Nvidia GPUs, hundreds of thousands of them, millions of them, eventually. By the summer of 2023, Nvidia's H100 GPU, their flagship data center chip, priced between $30,000 and $40,000 per unit, was sold out until 2024. Not backordered for weeks, sold out for months. The GPU shortage became the most discussed infrastructure crisis in Silicon Valley. CEOs mentioned it on earnings calls. Startups spent months simply trying to get access to enough compute to train their models. Jensen Huang's chips had become the most precious industrial commodity on Earth, more sought after in some circles than oil. The financial results were staggering. In fiscal year 2024, Nvidia's revenue hit $60.9 billion, up 126% in a single year. Their data center business alone generated $47.5 billion, up 217%. In fiscal year 2025, revenue more than doubled again, reaching $130.5 billion. Gross margins exceeded 75%. In the most recent quarters of fiscal 2026, data center revenue hit $51.2 billion in a single quarter. Not a full year, a single quarter. To put that in perspective, in 2019, Nvidia's entire annual revenue was just under $12 billion. It had grown more than 10 times in 6 years. The hyperscalers, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, Meta, together are expected to spend approximately $725 billion on AI infrastructure in 2026. The majority of that money flows through Nvidia. But this is where the story becomes more complicated than just a simple triumph. Because every one of those companies is also building their own chips. Google has been developing its TPU, Tensor Processing Unit, since 2015, and is now on its 7th generation. Amazon has Trainium and Inferentia. Microsoft has Maya. Meta is deep in development on its own custom silicon. The strategic logic is clear. If you're spending tens of billions on Nvidia hardware every year, and you're sophisticated enough to design your own chips, the long-term math eventually pushes you toward reducing that dependency. Jensen Huang has known this was coming for years. His response has been to build something that no custom chip can easily replicate, a full computing platform. Nvidia isn't just a chip company anymore. It's a company that sells chips, networking hardware, server systems, software frameworks, cloud services, and developer tools, all engineered to work together in ways that create performance advantages impossible to achieve with any individual piece. Their NVLink interconnect technology allows thousands of GPUs to share data at extraordinary speeds. Their software ecosystem now spans robotics, autonomous vehicles, drug discovery, and climate simulation. The moat isn't just CUDA anymore. It's an entire technological infrastructure that took 30 years to build. There's another threat that's harder to ignore: China. The US government has imposed sweeping export restrictions on Nvidia's most advanced chips, the H100, the H200, and the Blackwell series, blocking their sale to Chinese buyers. The intention is to prevent China from accessing the AI computing power needed to develop frontier AI models with potential military applications. In April 2025, the restrictions tightened further. Nvidia took a $4.5 billion charge on H20 inventory, a lower-spec chip designed specifically to comply with earlier restrictions, when new rules made even that chip subject to export licenses. The result? Chinese chipmakers rushed to fill the vacuum. By 2025, domestic Chinese manufacturers had captured roughly 41% of China's own AI accelerator market. That's a market that just years earlier belonged almost entirely to Nvidia. The geopolitical dimension of semiconductor competition has become inseparable from the commercial one. Nvidia is simultaneously building factories in the United States, partly in response to political pressure, partly as strategic insurance, while navigating a world in which its largest growth market is increasingly closed off. Jensen Huang has called the U.S. export restrictions very painful, warning that restricting Nvidia's access to China could accelerate Chinese domestic chip development rather than slow it. It's a genuine tension without a clean answer. None of these threats have yet managed to slow Nvidia's growth in any meaningful way. In the third quarter of fiscal 2026, Nvidia's revenue hit $57 billion in a single quarter. Blackwell GPU sales, Jensen Huang said, were off the charts. Cloud GPU capacity, he added, was sold out. In October 2025, Nvidia became the first public company in history to cross a $5 trillion market cap. To reach that number, the company had to grow more than 500 times from its IPO value in 1999. It took a child who cleaned toilets at a reform school in Kentucky. It took the $5 million lifeline from a video game company that got nothing in return. It took CUDA, a bet that took years to pay off, that the market largely ignored, and that quietly became the foundation of modern artificial intelligence. It took AlexNet, trained in a bedroom on 2 consumer gaming cards. It took ChatGPT arriving at the precise moment when Nvidia's data center infrastructure was mature enough to absorb the demand surge. And it took Jensen Huang, who has led the same company without interruption for over 30 years, navigating every wave of disruption in the chip industry, never once losing the thread of his original conviction that parallel computing would reshape everything. There is a question worth sitting with, beyond the market cap numbers and the quarterly earnings beats. Nvidia didn't just build a successful company. It built the infrastructure on which humanity is now constructing its most consequential technology. Every major AI model, the systems that are beginning to diagnose disease, design pharmaceuticals, write code, translate languages, and reason about problems that once required human specialists, runs, at some foundational level, on Nvidia silicon. The company that was 1 month from bankruptcy in 1997 became the shovel seller for the most important gold rush in history. And maybe that's the most important thing to understand about why Nvidia matters. Not the revenue, not the stock price, not the competitive moat. It's that when historians eventually look back at the moment when artificial intelligence moved from laboratory curiosity to civilizational force, they will find Jensen Huang's chips at the center of almost every breakthrough. A 9-year-old cleaning toilets in Kentucky could not have imagined any of this. Neither could the rest of the world. That's usually how the future arrives. If you made it to the end of this video, genuinely, thank you. This story deserved to be told properly, and I hope it felt that way. One question before you go. What was the single moment in this story that hit you hardest? Was it Jensen's childhood? CUDA being ignored for years? AlexNet trained in a bedroom? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one, and I genuinely want to know. And if this is the kind of story you want more of, the real stories behind the companies and the people shaping the world, subscribe. New video coming soon, and it's one you will not want to miss.